Hello everyone, today we talk about Æthelstan's rise to power and early reign through certain aspects, a bit of his background that is relatively mysterious, together with a bit like the political, but also familiar situation at the time of his accession to power. The international exploit, mostly the Anglo-Saxon imperial awareness on Britain, and the early sovereigns' charters that show not just an important step forward in the organization of a proper English state, English power, English monarchy, but also certain, let's say, notes of how this power was agglutinated in a situation of not complete, let's say, better recognition from the entire Anglo-Saxon world. Æthelstan, anyhow, stands out as a major figure in English history. He is credited by many historians as the first king of the English, right? And we already talked about his international and strategic accomplishments in the video about the Battle of Brunanburh, fought in 937, which accounts for actually the greatest battle in Anglo-Saxon warfare, right up to that point, and it displays much of that sort of background, also the use of Norse mercenaries from the Anglo-Saxon side, not just fighting, in fact, the Vikings broadly meant, the ones from Ireland, namely together with the Scots, etc., and any other power that was trying, not just to resist Anglo-Saxon expansion, but trying to break down the same truly English polity as it had been established. And in fact, the Battle of Brunanburh is considered to have boosted dramatically that sense properly of unity under Æthelstan as the first king of England, right? It reaffirmed essentially the right of the Anglo-Saxons to rule over the other British peoples of the British archipelago, and to in fact succeed in the consolidation of Anglo-Saxon England as the dominant power in the region. This, I can't stress enough how important this is. We haven't made so much Anglo-Saxon history. I mostly skirted around the Saxons. So far, we still have to cover Northumbria. I only recently talked about Mercia for our historical region series, but there is definitely hundreds, to say the least, of videos to make before we get to some satisfactory picture of course, of the of Anglo-Saxon history, of the English early Middle Ages, if you prefer. But Æthelstan, in fact, ruling from 924 to 939, is one of those steps that you must forcibly pass through in order to understand the process, and I'm glad we talk about it now. So Æthelstan was the son of Edward the Elder. Thus, his grandfather was Alfred the Great. And when we look at 10th century Anglo-Saxon history, we realize how much his reign stands out for the aforementioned reason. Right? Brunanburh did really play the greatest role in this affirmation, also thanks to the celebration of Æthelstan's victory in a famous poem contained in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. Consider that the Anglo-Saxons were still living within sort of hybrids. But by this point, of course, they were Christianized. They had definitely begun to surpass their particularisms to understand, of course, the enormous potential that this the people as a whole, these peoples, but still coalescing under a single rule, would have. In fact, for the international prestige and for defending themselves from the Norse, from all that process that had gradually contributed to establish even an infrastructural net of defense of the country and the possibility of striking back. These years in the Æthelstan was born around 894, which makes him 30 at the moment of his rise to power. And these had been decades of continuous Anglo-Saxon victories over the Vikings. Right, it had begun to define different spaces, even though there would still be an Anglo-Danish syncresis, basically hybrid, by the time of the Norman conquest. Definitely this occurred on the basis of the Kingdom of the English. And Æthelstan is considered in this sense also a great statesman, recognized abroad as such. He is often compared to his grandfather, Alfred the Great, and yet we do not know too much about the political dynamics that stood behind his rise to power. That seemed to have been influenced by the pre-existing conflict that existed actually between and especially the two major Anglo-Saxon powers here, Wessex and Mercia, the latter actually having lost steam fundamentally over time and being having began to be subsumed by, in fact, a southern Saxon power. We've seen also in the videos about from the Norman conquest onwards for the Kingdom of England, how still the Midlands were a bit of a world on their own. They often rebelled. The various baronial civil wars were sort of showing this pattern, right? London, the South, the Channel basically versus the hinterland. And it was much of these local legacies. I have a video in store about the tribal Hide Age that in part shows this mechanism of political and territorial consolidation, but also continuity in the subdivisions of the Anglo-Saxon world. Anyhow, Æthelstan definitely worked during his reign to provide with an increasing gluing factor for these all these elements. An intriguingly complex coinage that we'll see better in another video, but also and especially a corpus of legal texts that is definitely unusual in richness and variety, and that all really represents the next steps by scale in the establishment, in fact, at this point of a true English monarchy, and proving through that not just the ambition of this ruler, but the actual success, because we understand through all these instruments there were lots of people working for him, and with a serial operational mode that definitely shows the structure, like the solid basis behind this, and so confirming this great ruler's achievements. And the reason why we of course celebrate Alfred the Great more, like just in pop culture, is perhaps the merit of his bibliographer Asser, right? Æthelstan did not enjoy a same contemporary biography. Actually, we have to rely for an important part of his information and information on him, as we'll see now, on the later Anglo-Norman historian William of Malmesbury. The location is not random, as we will see now, because that's first of all Æthelstan's burial place, but it's essentially a town in just at the border, a few miles with Mercia. That mirrors a bit the discontinuity also with Æthelstan as West Saxon milieu compared to his paternal line of power. the closer connection with Mercia was instrumental just for making a true kingdom of England. You couldn't really do one without the other. Wessex could have never simply overrun Mercia. These were just, as we will see now with Northumbria, that was controlled by the Saxons for the first time under Æthelstan. You have just a recognition of power, and of course, just a support was given by all these various chunks, right? But definitely, Æthelstan's figure deserves an enormous place in 10th century European history. William of Malmesbury was not necessarily a very reliable source, but it does contain information that we wouldn't know otherwise. For example, about Æthelstan's mother, that is a bit of a mysterious figure, and it is based on earlier, say, Anglo-Saxon sources that are today lost, right? That did talk about Æthelstan, and some local traditional, let's say, cult of this figure, right? Malmesbury was the same place again when the king was buried, so there was all sense of pride, right? That was boasted by the local clergyman. In any case, that's also how few we know about Anglo-Saxon history compared at this point to, of course, much more extensively documented continental Europe, etc. And there is this first enigma regarding the tensions existing at the time of Æthelstan's accession to the throne, all right, that were basically played within the West Saxon royal family, of which Æthelstan was the rightful heir, but not the only one, and that seemed to, let's say, suggest still a potential rift created on the basis of different allegiances, say, provided by these various chunks of this coalescing England, right? Was not yet fully formed. There are many voices about this. Alfred the Great at some point celebrated his grandson Æthelstan in a moment of civil strife, perhaps to try to confer greater solidity to his bloodline, against usurpers. They were all sort of married to each other, but as we'll see, Æthelstan had a brother, Elfwerd, that was actually the half brother, and that gained before him, after Edward the Elder's death, recognition as king in Wessex, differently from Æthelstan, that wouldn't be recognized as such, but later. Even a substantial time after Elfwerd's death, that occurred actually only a couple of weeks after his father's, and the point being that we do not know exactly what at this point in history the Anglo-Saxon, at this point I say Anglo-Saxon in a, not in an ethnic but in a political sense, meaning an English, right, succession, right, for monarchy, especially for those who had achieved this overlordship over different elements of the so-called Eptarchy, right? It is that we do not know exactly what Alfred the Great or Edward the Elder thought in terms of whom should have ruled where, right, especially in the of their successors, especially when there were more than one, right? And so that could have different ambitions, and one would have liked to just be recognized as king, because the tradition was recognizing the king, right? Just even in very dynastic contexts, like, for example, the Carolingian one, in theory, like, it was about the people electing the king still. And so the West Saxons would elect their own king, and the Mercians their own. And so just the eventual titles we will read now regarding the overlordship, even on the entirety of Britain, that Æthelstan boasted, were a novelty that still had to, let's say, deal with the recognition of the various single elements. And sometimes we do not know actually what the local communities thought about that, or at least we know, and especially the non-Anglo-Saxon element was often not particularly happy, to say the least. We will see now with Wales. But the interesting aspect about Æthelstan's accession to power at his father's death was the information we get from the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle that Æthelstan was chosen by the Mercians as king, right? While again his half-brother gained recognition as king in Wessex. So we have literally no idea in which circumstances, in which relations, especially between the two siblings, this happened, right? Edward the Elder may have planned this division of the kingdom at this date, but he may have not, right? And whatever his intentions were, by the way, they could have simply been bypassed at this point. There was a double recognition, almost basically in parallel, of Æthelstan and Æthelwerd for their respective peoples, and this seems to suggest that at least there was some prior acknowledgement of what either of the two heirs were rooting for, being expected to succeed where, right? The point is that we do not know what the title of King of the Anglo-Saxons that was already present would have been chosen by whom, right? It's obvious that if two different peoples within the same kingdom recognize this different kings fundamentally on their own, that sense of unity is a bit challenged. Right? Let's remember that the Mercians had not been particularly happy of the rise of the West Saxons. They had basically been forced, especially by the Viking onslaught, to give up, right, much of their power. They Alfred the Great settlement was for the settlement of Guntram's Norse in eastern Mercia, while the West Saxons would have maintained a control over the rest. There was also an intermarriage between the two lines, the two monarchic houses, and so this, as we said before, had already paved the way for a agglutination of the two areas, at least in terms of political recognition. But that's exactly what it boiled down to. So if you do have instead a different recognition, things seem to have been sort of pretty hot. Also because, again, Æthelwerd was recognized by the West Saxons like just immediately after Edward's death as their king, in spite of the fact that he died just a couple of weeks later. So everybody was ready for that. That can mean different things at a time. The idea of a conflict between two parties, at least within, it's not necessarily just Mercia versus Wessex. It's rather which leverages of power are being supported by whom. Even within Wessex, that was the true ruling monarchy within the system, right? So we do not have good evidence for what happened between 910 to 924. There's no charter evidence, which prevents us from understanding what was happening in Wessex, in Mercia, and more in general in the center of Anglo-Saxon power. All right. One may thus wonder what reasons may have been for friction, for disagreement within the Anglo-Saxons, specifically Wessex and Mercia, regarding this double different recognition. So there is a voice which states that Æthelstan may have been born out of an irregular liaison, let's say, between Edward the Elder and his first wife, that was also said to be of low birth. This is actually seemingly not the case at all, or at least we have no way of saying that. William of Malmesbury actually tells us that Æthelstan's mother was Ecwin or Ecwinna. We know practically nothing of her, but there is nothing either to suggest, also considering Edward's standing, that she would have been a person of lower birth, right? She was likely actually a noble woman, right, and also connected with some other important milieu, including the ones of St. Æthelstan, etc. And therefore, it's been speculated scholarly that this voice circulated as a smear, like essentially as a fabrication to claim, but importantly enough, if this was the case within a conflict, right, between the two half brothers, and to of course bring Æthelstan's status down, right? Consider that Æthelstan, this is more interesting, had been brought up at the Mercian court, the one of Ethelred and Æthelflaed, and this had been happening also in moments of turbulence between Wessex and Mercia. We do not know literally what Æthelstan connection with this really was. There's simply no evidence. Æthelred instead seems to have been brought up exclusively at the Western Saxon court, and designated therefore as his heir, as the son of Edward by his wife Æthelflaed, and this would make him, of course, also of course perfectly and legitimately succeeding his fathers in the position. So we do not know, unfortunately. This is, in the absence of sources, something that's not to ever be explained, what was occurring between the two politically. However, one may easily think that, given the local recognitions, Æthelstan, having been supported by a Mercian establishment, or a part of Western Saxon nobility, that rooted for that orientation, right? Æthelstan may have taken charge of his father's Mercian interest himself after the death of Æthelflaed in 918. So Æthelstan may have already been a experienced politician, administrator, right? Whereas Wessex preferred that Æthelflaed, and as the local power brokers worked out, he was elected by the Western Saxon. The fact that Æthelflaed died so soon, by the way, was pretty, timely. If for his half brother, if this was to escalate into some broader conflict, that there is some potential sign of, but it was brought down by just by the fact that now that was the lawful heir to Edward the Elder. It's important to see how Æthelflaed was buried in the new minster at Winchester, that, as you know, was essentially the main center of Western of Wessex, and while Æthelstan, as we've seen, would be buried later in Malmesbury at essentially the boundary with Mercia, and the and there was a lack of support from the sort of most representative Western Saxon establishment at some point of Æthelstan's reign, without this really escalating in anything particularly serious, but still showing a malaise right against him, which of course was not optimal, but did not undermine the ruler's achievements and caliber, broadly speaking, as we said at the beginning. Æthelstan also did not immediately succeed his half-brother as king of the West Saxons. Right, there were some steps necessary to be recognized as such. We have a charter dating to 925 that still shows Æthelstan's authority not have been recognized outside of Mercia. Right. This didn't mean, of course, that Æthelstan didn't have a control already on parts of Wessex, but still, right, it was not even necessarily that important as a role, because again, this sort of this monarchical English power now floated over whichever chunk was sort of more viable, and again, the Western Saxon Mercian connection was now particularly strong. So it's not to say that there were literally a single country, single people, but they were still within the major sort of southwestern Anglo-Saxon power that made the English monarchy, and that would allow Æthelstan, in fact, to extend power far beyond, even for the first time over Northumbria, even launching an invasion of Scotland, which was not very appreciated by the rest of the British. The southeastern Saxon lands were not, as we've seen in the original historical series, in the condition to oppose much resistance in the first place. They were just living, minding their own business, recognizing Western Saxon power now, and sort of enjoying this broader agglutination trade with the continent, right? Trying to especially receiving support also against the Norse vacations in Britain, and so playing along. The aforementioned 925 charter, by the way, tells us that Æthelstan was literally the supervisor of the Christian household of the whole region, well nigh in the whirlpools of cataclysm. And this, of course, can mean different things, because definitely there were external enemies, but internal turmoil, especially triggered by the lack of substantial Western Saxon support, would have played a relevant role, evident. We see Winchester as the center of anti-Æthelstan's opposition. This is what William of Malmesbury seems to suggest in his Gesta Regum. The Bishop of Winchester, for example, does not appear to have attended the king's coronation in 925 either. Right, and Winchester was, again, the center of crowning. The local bishop was traditionally involved in the ceremony as protagonist, etc. So the fact also that the Bishop of Winchester is clamorously absent from the witness lists of charters issued in 926, in the presence, of course, of important figures, is quite telling. Æthelstan's reign is completely skipped by the account of the history of the New Minster, which is a late 10th century source based Winchester, and that's also, definitely the evidence of the fact that Æthelstan had never quite been liked for some reason there. We're talking about high circles of West Saxony. Plus the Atheling Edwine, that was Elfward's brother, full brother, that was taken out 933, at Gifu, that was Edward the Elder's surviving queen, never attest her stepson's charters either. So we see that something was wrong along in that line of the very royal house of Wessex. Æthelstan, as we've seen, was buried not at the Edwardian mausoleum at New Minster, but in the Abbey of Malmesbury. He had died in Gloucester in 939, by the way, so this all means something. It will have not been that easy to rule with this constant thorn in the side, especially when consolidating the image of what was actually, and for sure, a successful king of the English, right? But this is in part, I would say, the point, where it was, even when Wessex was responsible for de facto, at least the major unification of the Anglo-Saxons politically, still, it was about the Anglo-Saxons. It wasn't necessarily all about Wessex and its greater centers of power, right? I think this is quite meaningful also because of, again, the clamorous victory at Brunanburh, the support that Æthelstan received all across England. We do not know any better, though, so we have to be just humble and realizing that whatever political situation was going on in the mid 920s, there is no way to get more information, right? Moving on, however, Æthelstan's charters initially regard him as king of the Anglo-Saxons. This was the tradition established by his grandfather, Alfred the Great, that, as you know, is the one who sort of ransomed the Anglo-Saxon honor against the Norse and established this first basis for the Anglo-Saxon monarchy. This concept was perpetuated by Edward the Elder, Æthelstan's father. So this was now in the wake of a very specific and political and territorially evident reality, right? And this was so much the case that Æthelstan brings the concept even further, right? Aside from the various sort of Anglo-Saxon, even Ute identity, and so how all the various elements of the Heptarchy consider themselves. I will not digress, at least in this video, but as we were saying at the beginning, these peoples traditionally considered themselves as separated, right? They were now joining as Anglo-Saxons because they consider themselves, after all, like part of that Germanic invading element that had conquered Britain back in the day, that now was substantially differentiated, also because Christian and importantly territorialized through this monarchy from actually peoples that came from almost the same places in the guise of the Vikings now, and against whom, of course, this well-settled population of the English now had been fighting in spite of the hybrids. But in fact, there were areas of Britain also populated by the Anglo-Saxons that were, as you know, sort of more archaic, more reactionary, conservative. They didn't like these sort of richer, apparently more gentrified, more degenerated Southerners that were, however, very powerful. In fact, wanted to strip them of their power. Certain areas had been also hijacked by the same Norse, so the local Anglo-Saxons had ended up for supporting the Viking rule in order to escape this centripetal force of the south. This is particularly interesting because naturally when Æthelstan came to power and managed to boast such a grandiose perception of his monarchy, this went in parallel with a real expansion. For example, in 926, just after his sent to power, actually the securing of also the Western Saxon election, Æthelstan gave his sister in marriage to Sihtric, that was the king of the Northumbrians, that had been, in fact, the most sort of hybrid with the Norse element in that anti-Saxon function. Sihtric died the year later, and at this point, surprise, surprise, King Æthelstan, as the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle tells us, succeeded to the kingdom of the Northumbrians. And we do not know any better how or why this happened, right? Whether this had been planned with Sihtric. There had been initially a mutual non-aggression treaty between the two, and of course this matrimonial alliance through Æthelstan's sister, of course, was telling, of course, of the normalization of these relations, of the fact, again, that the Saxons had become substantially powerful to the point of coming to rule over this place. The ruler was recognized through a military expedition that brought York under Æthelstan's control, and this was seemingly a major red flag, major alarm for all the other British people that had not been ended up, but were about to, evidently, in a word or another, under the Anglo-Saxon monarchy, right? Think about the Bretwalda, right? It's literally I made a video on that. It's a concept that, again, the Germans in Britain had incredibly clear in mind since the very first moment they set foot on the island, right? It was just their modus operandi. It's the old imperial Catholic tradition. Doesn't matter whether it's Christian or pagan, it's always the same concept. And of course, the Anglo-Saxons, even before their political unity in a monarchic guise, had been toying, first of all, with the idea of having, in fact, an overlord for all the Anglo-Saxons, but that as such was meant to extend over all over Britain and Ireland alike. This is particularly important to understand also the degree of Æthelstan's power. This was, again, the first time the Northumbrians were brought under a southern monarchy. And the Celtic fringe, the Norse, in pretty much all around, especially the Berna Norse in Dublin, the Scots, were pretty much triggered by this, which is seemingly what led eventually to Æthelstan's invasion of Scotland. It was eventually not leading to anything permanent, because this was just before the Battle of Brunanburh, where actually was these powers that invaded England. We do not know exactly where Brunanburh was, where was the actual battlefield. I in part discussed it in the video about the battle, which was a clamorous success, to say the least. In many ways, it's a very typical British battle, at least for the type of warfare of the time and the places. We'll make more videos about British warfare battles as well. And here we do see the defeat of Hywel, king of the West Welsh, Constantine, king of the Scots, Olwain, king of the people of Gwent, Aldred, son of Eadwulf from Bamborough. There were Anglo-Saxons from the enemy side, right? They weren't just Celts or Vikings. And this is important because, of course, well, the political test that Anglo-Saxon England underwent here, it was exceptional. It was not an Anglo-Saxon victory. It was an English victory. I can't stress this enough. This is exactly the moment in which that Englishness incarnates itself. Basically, this onslaught coming from all this virus power concerted to stem Anglo-Saxon affirmation fails, right? They understand that there is no way to prevent the consolidation of an English monarchy. Doesn't matter how still threatening and pervasive the Norse are, how, of course, England would transform itself in the following centuries into an Anglo-Danish society. The latter would still be grafted on the English monarchy. When you look at Knut the Great, his maritime empire, well, he's a hell of a actually good king of England, right? And of course, that is the basis from which also the Normans will start to rule, and that will remain essentially Anglo-Saxon in nature for the rest of history, and thanks to these steps taken at the time. It was an incredibly brutal battle. I mean, these all these various invading contingents suffered severe losses, to say the least. So Æthelstan had made his point, right? And there is a peace with pledges and oaths in a locality called Imant on July the 12th of 927, in which these defeated foes also renounce idolatry, right? And basically are allowed to also depart without further, say, chasing, etc. The problem, especially with Scotland, had been triggered since Æthelstan had affirmed its control over Northumbria, and so this was seen as an important territorial issue for what the Scottish, say, monarchy, even very embryonally, was developing. Like the English were already stronger, and it would be historically a continuous process of Anglicization, so the Scottish lowlands, as you know. And that's an interesting story we'll have to deal with in detail. I made a video about medieval Scotland in general that tells you a bit the vicissitudes of the Scots at this point. And this is what defines, in fact, properly an English kingdom territorially. Æthelstan establishes a polity on its own with specific territorial boundaries. As such, this was also to last until the end of his reign intact, right? To witness the solidity of its of the accomplishment. Æthelstan's charters indicate that from that moment onwards that he was regarded as the Rex Anglorum, so King of the English. This is also interesting because, as you know, he would have been a Saxon technically, but the Regnum Angli, as it was also known later on historically, like the prevalence of the English dimension of the Anglo from the Anglo-Saxons, is also affirmed already by these titles. And as we were saying before, there is the old imperial ideology for which Æthelstan styles himself as Rex totius Britanniae, which means, in Latin, quite limpidly, King of the Whole of Britain. This is beautiful. It was a title used by also other peoples who were contesting a broader regional space. For example, the Longobards called themselves Rex totius Italia because there were still Byzantine pockets at some point remaining, and they were essentially stressing the political unity, also in a geographical sense. Here it was basically the same. I think that in spite of the fact that naturally throughout the ages specific English, Scottish, Welsh, and Irish identities were defined, of course the hegemonic role of England was always there from even before the political subjection, right? Culturally, as we were saying just right now, you can see it even in the equipment, in the panoply. I made a video about, for example, the Scottish pikemen of the 14th. I mean, you find details, the influences, a general. Think about the panoply, etc. That is also, especially after the Norman conquest, also very connected with the continent. But that especially has to do in this insular context with the predominance of the English in Britain. The poem composed in, at least apparently in direct celebration of the English victory at Brunanburh, uses this beautiful term ista perfecta Saxonia, right, which means this Saxony, now perfected, made whole, right, almost recompacted, right, done in that mate that it must be. Here, interestingly enough, it's not Anglia but Saxonia, right, so not England but Saxony. But that would depend, as we were saying, about like also the local Anglo-Saxon sort of variations. The Rex Totius Britanniae thing was proclaimed on Æthelstan's coins as well. So this was a big slogan, by the way, a way to signify the power, the solidity, the reliability of English power, of the English monarchy. And naturally we can wonder how much the rest of the Britons at least would agree with this declaration. There is, needless to say, a contrary Welsh poet of the time. This is sort of a prophecy work that is, I think Welsh is, I don't know about you, but I think of the surviving Celtic languages is the most beautiful, but I will butcher its pronunciation, which is Arms Prydain Bawr, which in fact sounds like the great prophecy of Britain, Prydain being, as you know, Britain. And it talks about the Saxon scoundrels that, launch invasions of their beautiful Wales to the beautiful Wales that basically, is able to chase them. I mean, to at least to push them back. The text says that there were the oppressors would have been driven back to the sea. The Saxon foxes would flee through ramparts of the fortress. Stewards of the great king at Cirencester would collect afflictions, not taxes. The English will flee straight away to Winchester, so the Western Saxon capital, and when the men of Wessex will come together in council in a single party of one mind with the Mercian incendiaries. Remember that the Mercians were the ones that bordered more directly with Wales. We have seen it in the video about Mercian, think about Æthelstan, etc. And so that they were the ones who fought the most from the Midlands against this Romano-Britons. And they, hoping to bring shame on our splendid hosts, the Welsh poet says, right, and that they would meet with a crushing defeat. Actually, more often than not, of course, the English were superior, to say the least, and the Welsh were just profiting mostly of the English disorders, just to launch their own raids and having to come back home. And Brunanburh was definitely just a bigger display of that for all the enemies of this unified England. Which is also interesting to think at the time. I mean, it's a very modern conception of what effectively would remain as the Kingdom of England historically, already at the beginning of the 10th century. Other great enemies of this project were the Hiberno-Norse of Dublin. As you know, there was a Viking, this was the most important settlement in Ireland, and all the major coastal towns, the major Irish cities today, of course, are a product of, sure, prior Gaelic settlement, but that were reinforced on the coast by the Norse fortified rings, and that were to store the plunder let's say, taken away from mainly from Britain, etc., but also having to do with the local Iberno-Norse lordships. The Irish didn't quite like the Norse, but of course they ended up marrying into them, and of course this Norse identity is also part of modern Irish culture. At this time, Dublin was ruled by Olaf Guthfridsson. I made a video, by the way, some months ago about Irish warfare at this point. Of course, there is plenty of Viking stuff as well. He was the guy who had combined force with the king of the Scots, Constantine. And you can argue that the Battle of Brunanburh had been fought not just to destabilize, to shatter, to break down the Kingdom of England, but in a more territorially realistic sense to regain control over York, that, as you know, had been at least the seat of a Viking realm of some sort because of the Northumbrian, again, support given to these invaders against the Saxons, and which would have been a heavy blow to Æthelstan in the north if this had succeeded, because as we've seen, there was his sisters at stake, the fact that this was really a complexion of Ista Perfecta Saxonia, or Anglia if you prefer, and Northumbria was big and not that easy to rule after all, so this Iberno-Norse failure is, as the Dubliners were quite connected with this broader mechanism of creating Viking encampments here and there, also on the British mainland, was a declaration of failure, right, of their project in a deep civilizational sense. I mean, England and the monarchy were the future. There was really not much that could be done at this point by these powers anymore. We observed how the Battle of Brunanburh was fought by essentially all the English, largely. It was mostly West Saxon and Mercian forces that made the bulk of the English army. Interestingly enough, and we have read it through the same saga, in Wegel's saga in the video about the Battle of Brunanburh, there were Norse mercenaries siding with Æthelstan, importantly enough, and they were actually quite good at listening to the saga. This is technically who won the battle for the Anglo-Saxons. They were fierce fighters, and of course the Norse ward was fragmented enough, and the English, affluent enough to dispose, to employ these Viking mercenaries against these other forces, right? Which of course tells you how there were Norse protege clients, mercenaries in the Anglo-Saxon royal court. It was completely normal. It had been the case. Again, England had already been injected with an element of mostly Danish forces, even though these were mostly Norwegians, if I'm not wrong. Made just yesterday a video about medieval Iceland, the connection also with Scotland and Ireland, and also a video about medieval Norway, videos about Scandinavian warfare, Anglo-Saxon warfare, so you have plenty of stuff to watch if you still haven't. I really advise you to do that, because I don't focus prevalently my background on northwestern European warfare, but I say that the more time passed, the more I got fascinated with that. Of course, there are lots of interesting details that, if you go step by step, are going to make a very interesting bulk of stuff. I always feel like I never talk about these topics, but when I look at Great Britain and Ireland, this playlist, I say, well, it's not that few after all, and it's interestingly also an important amount of military stuff. Æthelstan's base of power was definitely in the south of England. This was not to be disputed. That's what could not really be hijacked by any of this power at this point. and naturally the northern control was more tenuous for Æthelstan, but that's why again Brunanburh and the consequences of it are so clamorous, because it really showed overall that the decisive moral support of the local population went to the project of a Kingdom of England. Now there is a last reflection we can make on Æthelstan's charters that were issued after an important period of gap that we were talking about before under his father Edward the Elder. From 925 to 939 we have really a lot of governmental provisions witnessing not just the energy of this ruler, but the organization laying behind this incipient English monarchy. Much of this is generally true throughout all history. Let's say this process of political cohesion stemmed from military needs, right? The metus of Stylus. If it hadn't been for the Viking invasions, the Anglo-Saxons would have, of course, had less needs to unite in this way. There would have been more competition. I mean, they would have ended up to become a kingdom of some sort. But let's say the way it happened, the way it was accelerated, was definitely due to this. Æthelstan was, as we've seen, military active to significant degree, spacing again regionally with the Anglo-Saxon army that was not, it was far from a professional system, right? It mostly focused on the militia levies and this sort of semi-professional sort of NCOs figures, and of the Thanes and their say the various clientary connection to the elder man, to the various rulers, etc. But the system did work, right? Much of it had been compacted again for defense, and many of these militiamen were also just expected to defend their boroughs from the Norse pirates. But as we've seen, the political consensus under Æthelstan was such that he could literally invade Scotland, right, in the 10th century, and not, of course, with the intention of occupying it. That they would have never. It was impossible, but just to show, right, who was stronger, of course, placing the enemy in a condition of inferiority from which revenues would have been drawn, and so on. So when you look at these charters, we see definitely the work needed to make all this system work. There is an initial series of charters produced in Æthelstan's name between 928 and 935. The guy writing this was a single one, really. We do not know his name. He was evidently a trustee, someone who had refined this craft of handwriting, of diplomatics, if you want. Now, this charter's content is not really a big deal. Right? Just to make an example, one from 1931 simply certifies how the king gave an estate of 9 hides at Ham in Wiltshire to one of his thane, who we were talking about them before, Wulfgar. But this was a system of reward, not just for military purposes, but political one. I mean, they're all intertwined. The interesting thing about these charters, however, as a whole, first of all, we see how many charters could be handwritten literally by this guy under a king, right, showing this important royal capacity to simply ask the scribe to write this and being able to issue them. This is not a few, right? Because this is not seemingly dependent on this or that figure in different eras. Now there is a sort of trustee of the king that really gets things say, done in this sort of craft, and the charter is valid and it can be issued. There is no uncertainty about that. You simply could do that, right? Normally, Anglo-Saxon kings up to that point had been relying on different royal priests, other members of religious houses, and that would operate more on their own than literally under the king, right? So mostly on his behalf, or just maybe these were the guys of the beneficiaries that wanted to see this charter written their own way. Instead, at this point, we see that Æthelstan has reached an unprecedentedly sort of hierarchical and homogeneous role in the issuing of these charters. And this definitely speaks of an early and importantly developed royal bureaucracy of some sort, right? We know very few about. Well, okay, we know something about how these charters were written, where, etc. But remember that the Anglo-Saxon kingdom has a precocious bureaucratic, say, sedentarism to some degree. I mean, at least London would historically become, with Westminster, basically an older and more proper capital than Paris, right? And of course, because also the realm is more contained, but not only. It's a forma mentis. It has to do with the way the Anglo-Saxons really administered themselves, and they had a very advanced administration by the time of the Norman conquest. In fact, in spite of the issues of this system having partly degraded itself and privatized. The other aspect is paleographical in nature. That is to say, the writing style of these charters is very sophisticated in some sort, even flamboyant, which has two meanings. The first is that there is some sort of stylistic, aesthetical taste for this unitly. It shows the cultural milieu of the king's court in the hand of this functionary. But at the same time, it's also propagandistic, ideological tool. In fact, we notice that this type of graphy is used in the early phase of Æthelstan's reign, and when things stabilized further, like the scribe didn't, that evidently took great care and pride in his work, was not, say, could write more, say, bureaucratically, in fact, in a more mechanical fashion, less elaborate sort of way, because at the end of the day, this charters didn't have much to impress in style, but just to be issued, right? That's an indicator, sort of political thermometer of how effectively this charters would have been received without too many graphic, say, visual presentation. Let's put it in this way, right? Another very important aspect of these charters is that they show us a considerable amount of movement of the king and his counselors around the realm, right? This in part aside even from, well, yes, I suppose these really show, I mean, the scribe was always there, so this is not to go against what is said before regarding the stabilization of a bureaucracy here. It's not much the point. What is really important here is that, of course, a newly established kingdom of England in practice would require its monarch to be present, to be felt all across the territory. And it was a way, normally, it also has to create competition among the various subjects to host the king, to receive privileges from it, and so for the court to be maintained locally rather than and so just sparking the jealousy of even the more powerful that hadn't maybe wanted to give more power to the king, that now would compete instead to do so. Well, this is a mechanism that would live on considerably. I mean, still Elizabeth I was much of a traveler across England, in spite of all the assassination attempt she suffered. But just to say, like, how it was really normal up to that point, even for, again, the Kingdom of England, it's true at the time, was very sort of, especially in its chanceries, in the official places of power, was very, very well developed. There are also interesting prosopographic connections. We see, especially in a political sense, lots of sub-kings witnessing these charters. For example, some Welsh chieftains, bishops of otherwise unknown sees, abbots, and even earls from the literally Norse parts of England, which tells you, as I was saying before, the degree by which Æthelstan had aggrandized English power over these Celto-Norse periphery that had essentially, especially from the north side, emerged at the expense of the Anglo-Saxons. And so now there was a sort of coming back, right? Of course, I can't make a video about the Danelaw. Was not a particularly florid place in itself, nor a particularly stable one. But it's obvious that that would first of all become part of England, as it technically already was. But the capacity of Alfred the Great grandson just to even have this Norse element participating in the charter issuing, recognizing indirectly or directly the English monarchy is fantastic if you think about it so early in time. This early scribe is the same one using the terms as King of the English or King of the Whole of Britain for Æthelstan, so the same one that saw these things probably being delivered to the world in form. It's a symbolic way. Of course, it was an effort to enforce actually these high-sounding titles and roles, right? It wasn't easy to rule over this system, but it's still particularly relevant because this royal writing office would also prevail in Æthelstan's successor's court, and so the following royal charters would have, in great part, the same part of a certain part of this of Æthelstan's charters form, but less flamboyant actually, but that surely testifies to the power of this ruler and his enormous accomplishment for his people and house and country, right? And we will naturally look at this in part in other videos. I make these thematic choices because I think that sometimes they're better than others to sum up a little bit certain aspects that otherwise would go unnoticed, right? When Fig is making the regional history presentation and stuff like that, but another is to actually get down to the real history of the details sometimes, and the perspectives, the problems. It helps, right? It's an exercise. It's a way to keep things under an important level of control. For today, however, I stop it here. Just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.